No matter how big of a lead you have in any given championship, one error can be enough to throw it all away. Hello and welcome, fellow motorsports fans. We've witnessed an action-packed race weekend with a crucial mistake from Mattia Colnaghi in the E3 title battle, MP Motorsports fighting back in the Spanish F4 season opener, some mixed weather madness over in the American feeder series, and finally the proper start of the European karting circuit with the first round of the Champions of the Future. Lots to unpack, so let's get straight to it. The Spanish Winter Championship has concluded with the E3 title decided at Aragon, combined with a slightly odd switch in format compared to the previous rounds by only running 2 instead of the 3 races. Maciej Gladysz did the unthinkable by stealing the title from Mattia Colnaghi with a pair of excellent races, while the reigning Spanish F4 champion lost critical points by causing an incident in the first race and subsequently ruining his grid position for the second one. Definitely a bit of a short-sighted rookie error there in my opinion, but overall the pair performed brilliantly over the short season and I'm sure we'll get a good rematch over the summer. An equally big story for me personally was the surprise appearance from MP Motorsport at the front end, spearheaded by James Agozzi, breaking up the MP and Campos duality and even stealing P2 from Colnaghi in the process. The team has certainly made big steps in the right direction and Agozzi himself looks much more like his previous karting self. It almost feels like the Red Bull Junior team did more harm than good to him, but this is of course pure speculation. And while we're on the topic, we've also had the ongoing Red Bull Junior team battle playing out, where the trio of Jules Caranta, Enzo Tanvanichkul and Ernesto Rivera can all be summed up with good but not great. Tanvanichkul, as the youngest of the trio, does stand out, not just by age, but more importantly because I felt he was the least ready for this step up and should have probably done what Rene Lammers is doing by going for proper title attack in Spanish F4. Instead, Red Bull continues the trend of rushing drivers up the ladder with their sink or swim mentality, but it actually looks like the quick tie might be more on the swimming side of that equation, pulling off quite a few sweet moves this weekend. I don't like to look at the negatives too much, but I do have to call out a guy who got us all excited earlier in the year, FRAC breakout star Zach Sklar. The Kiwi has now done 2 of the 3 rounds for MP Motorsport and has found no success whatsoever, typically running miles away from the points or wrecking outright. I hope this is an anomaly, but at the same time it does remind me just a little too much of his drop-off in British F4 compared to his winter campaign last season. Spanish F4 had its first round and has thus officially kicked off the regular season with surprisingly clean races across the board, I have to say. Not at all like the Spanish F4 I know and love. We did get some proper penalty chaos in exchange though, making some of the end results not particularly meaningful. The main story coming into the weekend was of course our question from the Winter Series. Can MP Motorsports fight back against the Campos army? Turns out, yes, they could, with Rene Lammers finding a pair of wins on track, even if he could only keep one of them, and both Ian Eichmanns and Niklas Schaufler also getting some good time fighting at the front, even if, again, both also suffered from penalties and incidents. This very much looked like the Rene Lammers I had hoped for over the winter, the one that looks ready to fight for a big title. And while Reno Franco wasn't really the consistent force we may have expected, another man stepped up to fill the void. American youngster Hudson Schwartz inheriting not 1 but 2 podiums to put himself in the conversation as well. On the Campos side of things, we still had the ever-consistent pair of Thomas Strouven and Jan Przewski consistently fighting at the front as well, but I was pleasantly surprised to see both Vivek Kanfan and Noah Montero very much in the mix as well. Only really Miguel Costa was a bit off compared to the other youngsters. Meanwhile, Nathan Tighe struggled to get anything out of the Rodin, with the team reportedly struggling on the setup front all weekend long. I do want to quickly shout out Christopher Elfigali though. He may look a little disappointing for an F1 junior, and to be fair, on the racecraft front there are still some obvious issues, but it is easy to forget that he is driving for DriveX and not one of the big teams. And with Artem Sivaryukin and Ido Robinson, he has 2 pretty solid benchmark drivers, both of which struggled considerably more than him. And another rare negative shout out, not to a driver, but this time to a team. Santalock is still an absolute mess. despite drafting in Alex Powell, presumably to help with the setup. I very much hope the Carras brothers will get a chance to fight at some point later in the year, but at this point I'm not really too optimistic about it. Now, the quick jump over to the US, where we'll begin with the F4 USA, the only series where the big swap from a wet Saturday to a dry Sunday didn't massively affect results. I think we've got a pretty clear picture of the front end with Alex Popov, Cooper Shipman and Keke Hauanio, I keep forgetting how exactly to pronounce his name, pretty clearly established as the lead trio, although I was a tad disappointed with how error-prone Hauanio still looked despite this being his third year around this particular paddock. The rest of the small grid wasn't too great, to be honest, although Clement Huerta and Caleb Campbell at least both showed some decent potential. The renamed Junior Formula Championship, formerly known as the JSF4, the series funded to keep the older version of the F4 chassis alive, looked quite a bit better than last season, with a reasonably big grid, to be honest. And crucially, at least in the dry, it was actually a pretty competitive top half of the grid altogether. Returning drivers, Harbia Das and particularly Drew Such both put in some good races, but for me, debutant Gaston Erazu stole the show just a little bit. Not many drivers from Uruguay around to begin with, and he very much showed why he earned himself a scholarship. The most interesting aspect of the series though is the incredibly low age limit and a few of the solid looking young drivers this has allowed to show up. 14-year-old twins Cash and Roman Felber immediately established themselves as good midfield assets, even if Roman ended up being a little too crashy. And in many ways, 13-year-old, yes you heard that right, 13-year-old Max Mokarem impressed even more with his ability to fight for podium positions right off the bat. And for some female power, 14-year-old Ava Hansen may not have set the world on fire or anything, but was still at least around the midfield all weekend long, something that the rather poor backmarkers could certainly not say about themselves. The Formula Regional Americas continues its trend of slowly but surely constructing more competitive grids year after year, and it did make for both some great racing and some heartbreaking moments. Going into the season, I had Titus Sherlock, Brady Golan and Nicolas Ambiado down as the key title favourites, and for the most part this appeared to be true, although we had a couple of more surprising contenders at the front as well. Sherlock was the star of the mixed conditions on Saturday with a tyre gamble in race 1, only for his engine to give up just as he was dominating race 2, in some ways continuing the horrible luck from the USF Pro 2000 season opener. Golan cost himself big positions with the wrong tyre in race 1, but made up for it by inheriting the win in race 2. Meanwhile, Ambiado was far and away the best driver over the weekend, consistently working his way to the front and seemingly not really setting a foot wrong all weekend to find himself with a nice little lead going into the second round. Now to the surprise appearances. Bruno Ribeiro consistently fighting at the front after a bit of a messy first race was not something I had anticipated, although this may be more of an oversight on my part than anything. If he can keep up this sort of form, the championship just got one more competitive driver at the sharp end. Not as surprising, but still not quite expected, experienced Jet Bowling finding himself fighting for the win during the only dry race on Sunday. Sure, he was a lock for like top 5, but outright win contention also signals a bit of an improvement from last year for sure. And last but not least, Barrett Wolf with some very surprising wet weather proficiency. This one definitely caught me off guard, considering he has been nothing but a, no offense, pretty bad backmarker throughout his short single-seater career so far. And sure, he may have cooled back down in the dry, but I still very much hope this was a sign of better things to come in the future. This should have hopefully given you an idea of what's going on in the US, and I do encourage you to check out the JFC and Formula Regional Americas in particular going forward, even if the broadcast is sadly a little rough to watch at times. Anyway, it is time for the F1 Junior Team Kids in our quick weekly karting report. Champions of the Future, not to be confused with Champions of the Future Academy, has finally started the proper European karting season at Campiros this weekend. In case you aren't familiar with it, COTF is mirroring the FIA European Championship schedule and is acting as a bit of a warm-up race for those. The prestige of the title might not quite be the same on paper, but the grids and therefore the racing are basically identical. In the OK Juniors, Alpine junior Illie Crisan continued his great form from the WSK Supermaster Series to take a surprisingly comfortable win in the final, although aided by an interesting choice of starting side from pole sitter William Colnaghi. The latter still did bring home a podium, finally with proper form in the category after a difficult rookie season last year. He was one of the big players in the minis in 2023, so no surprise that he can in fact drive well. Dean Hugendorn, with his ever-consistent self, managed to claim P2 for the Williams Academy, and fellow Williams junior Will Green also beat newly signed Ferrari junior Noah Baglin to P6. Baglin signing for the FDA was a huge piece of news last week, signaling a key change in Ferrari's approach, signing karters instead of waiting for F4 rookies. As it turns out, with the current arms race F1 academies are having, barely any great potential and high budget drivers make it to F4 without a contract anymore. Quick shout out for the Italian, Bruno Blanco. He may have been dumped to P10 in the final, but considering this was his international debut, it was definitely a memorable weekend. The OK Seniors saw a dominant weekend from Spaniard Christian Costoya, defeating an entire Kart Republic army single-handedly to take the trophy for Parolin. And while I just said barely any great drivers stay out of academies until F4, he is definitely on this list. Either way, seeing him on the top is no big surprise whatsoever. We have talked about him as the best unsigned driver in the past. McLaren Jr. Dries van Langendonk, on the other hand, was initially looking like his biggest competitor, but eventually lost the remaining podium positions to Mercedes Jr. Kenzo Craigie and Jacopo Martinezzi. Very strong run from the rookie class all around, although it is quite normal in this category, it has to be said. Kart Republic ace driver Joe Turney got a penalty for jumping the start and was thus well out of contention. Tibor Ramekes and Eloy Gonzalez, the former also being very high up on my list of still independent great drivers, stole the show with big charging drives after both suffered a DNF in their respective superheat. Too many stories to really talk about here. This grid is mega stacked top to bottom. If you want to know next year's F4 stars in advance, this is very much the place to be. And since I got the request to make a bit of a Karting for Spectators explainer video, I'll do that when I find the time, so please feel free to drop any questions you've got down in the comments so I'll know what to include, along with all of your usual comments about this week's racing action, of course. And otherwise, I thank you all for watching and I do hope to catch you in the next video.